someone, I forget who it was exactly, um, suggested to me that Heinlein really was militaristic and everything, and these terrible militaristic politics, and he totally stood behind Starship troopers, and that proved it. Go to Wikipedia, they said. I thought, well, that makes it pretty easy if I had to really reread all of his books, because I think I've read, at least 90% of his books. He's kind of prolific when he was pulp writer. Uh, he wrote like junior science fiction. Okay. Um, so I did this. Let's see. I got a lot of pages open. I might not even have left that one open. You have to wait for me to go find it. I thought this was it, but this one is quantum erasure, quantum mind. Okay, Starship Trooper. It was the second link. It'll be quick. Don't worry. I know right on the page where I want to go. Okay. So yeah, the Wikipedia page says he wrote this to be pro-military. He was pro-nuclear energy. I knew that. It doesn't mean your politics are bad if you're pro-nuclear energy. He thought it was clean. You watch in the next 50 years, we're going to be using it to get rid of our carbon footprints. Okay. I have mixed feelings about it. Okay, this whole page goes through the plot. It's interesting. Reminded me what the book was like. I read it only many years ago, and it is pulp sci-fi, and it's for kids. You could say, well, there it's indoctrinating. It's pro-military, especially pro, like Marine, foot soldier. Let's see. Yeah, so he stood behind it. The page does say that, but also it says. Well, the literary criticism's funny. Some people talk about there's no romance, and it's for kids, for one thing. Why does it really have to have romance? Two, that the characters are thin. Well, they are kind of caricatures, like characterizations of attitudes and whatnot. Other people love it, of course. Now, the allegations of militarism are the main thing. The movie is much more militaristic than the book, I would think. But the book, shows a militaristic society. I don't think it's super clear that it advocates it. Because, for example, okay, let's see. Heinlein agreed that Starship Troopers, quote, glorifies the military, specifically the PBI, the poor bloody infantry, the mudfoot who places his frail body between his loved home and his war's desolation, but is rarely appreciated. He has the toughest job of all and should be honored. You really have a problem? Who has a problem with that? The book's dedication also reads in part, to all sergeants everywhere who have labored to make men out of boys. Yeah, well, he had some of that, and you can apologize for all of that, macho men, and also the paper-thin Laura Croft women that he had. But they had strong characteristics to them, so they weren't just being saved. They did a lot of the ass-kicking, so he was ahead of his time in that. It goes on, it says, however, he thoroughly disagreed that Starship Troopers was militaristic, arguing that the military personnel in the Terran Federation were not allowed to vote while on active duty since, quote, the idiots might not vote to make a drop, might vote to not make a drop, end quote, and that the military was thoroughly despised by many civilians. See, yeah, it was realistic in that sense. In a lot of his other books, he does, in all of his other books, he doesn't have militaristic societies. But there is military, and it's like some philosophers that have noted that, the world still relies on war. And, for other science fiction authors, making the enemy these alien bugs would just be typical. Of course aliens are like that. But that's not Heinlein. Heinlein understood something beyond that. They were alien in this to show, in a simple way, what if you have an enemy you really do have to fight? Sometimes it comes down to people being willing to fight. And that's just fact of life, boys and girls. To say this one book shows his whole political philosophy is different. Yeah, it obviously shows there is a pro-military aspect to Heinlein, but I don't think that characterizes his whole military. I've known the kind of Democrat that goes in the military families that are Democrats. You ever met them? To me, I see Heinlein as that kind of thing, much more progressive. And he's totally against conscription. Some people have complained. Now, the military, this I didn't know, evidently loves his book, and it's on the Marine reading list and things like this. And I would say it's somewhat fair, though it does glorify and thank people and make a point about to vote. You have to have done your 2 years of service, um, but there's all kinds of public service that can account for it, um, evidently. And I mean, he's obviously playing with these ideas. It's not like he put it in every book. Like Rand, every book is this same philosophical theme she's talking about. So I think, that means that that is her philosophy and characterizes her. Heinlein's, politics was, libertarian, but also progressive in many ways. And also he understood that his own tastes weren't the tastes of society. And you can see that in his books, that the character that seems to be his voice, is not necessarily, doesn't necessarily fit in, and it doesn't condemn society. It's an acknowledgement that for everybody else there's this other society, and also that times are changing. In Lazarus Long, Lazarus is probably most clearly the voice of Heinlein, if there is such a thing, and he, and he's an old guy. He's from a different era, and that's part of why he doesn't fit in. And yet, in the end, he does fit in, but just, as a curmudgeon type of a thing. The militaristic society is off of Sparta. It's a device. He knew how to focus. But anyway, it's funny because in this Wikipedia, there's nothing really to say that, yeah, he was a fascist. No, I mean, he makes his defense. I mean, the other thing is that the book, is very multiracial. There's, the main character is Filipino, and I could see a problem with the book in that, there's a demonization of the enemy, and in that sense it makes it simply pro-militaristic. But personally, taken in his whole body of work, I think it's like, well, yeah, he did. It's like looking at Kubrick and saying, didn't Kubrick do Clockwork Orange, and saying, that's what Kubrick's philosophy is. He thinks we should torture the criminals until they can't do wrong anymore. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, you can find some of his ideas in there, and certainly this is, he had a pro-military streak, but I don't think that speaks for his whole philosophy, and I don't think that's really necessarily wrong. I think the world still does need militaries because that's where the power is. And for example, if the U.S. and Europe didn't have militaries, I don't think that would be very good for us. Let's just face facts. I mean, I'd like to get to a world without militaries as much as anybody, more than many, and still I can admit that. I think Heinlein is a little bit like Lazarus Long. He's like an enlightened guy from a previous generation where you're surprised sometimes where he doesn't seem so enlightened, or he refuses to speak and think politically correctly. But if you look closely, I mean, his ideas are basically pretty progressive, if libertarian and individualistic. So that is that. The Wikipedia review, and we are out.